Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the Catholic Twitter Symposium. We're going to get right to it. Up first, with our first talk, is Noah Furin, or Furin. How do you say your name?
Furin.
Furin. Okay, Noah Furin. Um, I'll turn it over to you once I can figure out how to. Oh, you're already co-host. Perfect. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. Awesome. Then in that case, you can share your screen whenever you're ready and take it away from there.
Alrighty, let's do this.
I will spotlight your video.
Okay, can we all see everything pretty clearly? All right. So I would just like to introduce myself. I'm Noah. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm studying with the seminary for the diocese. When Hunter first announced the symposium, I thought, okay, what could I possibly talk about? And I thought, you know what? I really like the Western dress code. I've always been interested in it since I was a little boy. So I thought, yeah, I could probably put together a little talk about that. So I would like to present to you the Western dress code, an exposition of the common dress codes for the 20th and 21st century gentlemen. A little disclaimer, I am focusing mainly on the dress code of men because A, I only have 10 minutes, and B, I don't really know much about women's dress codes. So here we are with the Gentleman's Guide to Western Dress. Alrighty. So how did this all get started? Um, in the Victorian and Edwardian periods, near the end of the 19th century, there were two main ways for social dress code to be considered. So there was the undress and the full dress. After the end of those periods, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the two categories of undress and dress really sort of expanded into what we now have as the Western dress code. So during this presentation, I'm going to cover the casual wear, the informal wear, which is the equivalent of undress, semi-formal wear, and the formal wear, which is the equivalent of full dress. All right, so let's go right into it. So we have casual wear. This is what we see on the streets today. This is a standard, um, normal, modern, business casual dress code. So it originally developed with the popularization of spectator sport in England. So the people who went to see these sports started to emulate the athletes in their attire. And they really, it consists mainly of jeans and khakis um, with a collared shirt or even a t-shirt. If we move up, we go into informal wear, which is a suit and tie, which is pretty standardly considered formal wear nowadays, but in the 19th, 20th, and early 21st century, it was mainly considered informal wear. So this is for the business attire, business affairs. It was called leisure wear. It replaced the frock coat, which is a sort of suit jacket mixed with a skirt type of hybrid that was very popular in the 19th century. So we will see a lot of leisure suit jackets in the upcoming presentation. If we move up, we see a fine picture of our dapper Winston Churchill rocking the stroller, which is named for a German politician who found that the formal wear of the uh, Reichstag was a little too uncomfortable for him, so he decided to cut it down to a little more informal. The British call these black lounge suits, which consists of formal trousers that we'll see in morning dress of the formal class later on in the presentation, with a waistcoat and a leisure suit jacket, which was really the big renovation of all of that. The proper hat for this is a Homburg, which he is wearing right now, and then there's also the option for the bowler hat. Um, you'll note that the heading says daytime, so the rest of the classes of dress are usually split up into morning and evening attire. So if you have a semi-formal occasion during the daytime, that is to say about pre-6 o'clock, you would wear the stroller or the black lounge suit. If we go into the evening for semi-formal wear, we will see the classic tuxedo, also known as the black tie, the dinner jacket. You see this a lot in James Bond, very, very popular. These are for private affairs or dinners at one's own home, on occasion to weddings, orchestra and ballet galas, and cruise dinners. You'll note that there's a lot of black tie prominent in there. So what does that consist of? Usually a black leisure jacket, but the difference between this and a leisure jacket is it's one button and it has peaked satin or silk lapels. You'll also note a cummerbund or waistcoat to go along with all of this. So this is often worn to ballets or orchestras, not usually to operas. That's much more of a formal event. This is of course very popular in cinematography as the classy thing. You'll see this on the red carpet a lot, but it is not quite the most formal we can get. So we are going to move on into formal wear. For the morning, we'll see the royal family or part of the royal family. It's a little messy nowadays, I know that. So morning dress is the most formal that you can possibly be before 6 p.m. This is worn often to weddings. If you're in the wedding party, more specifically, you would wear these to horse races. If you're in court with royalty before 6 p.m., you would wear the morning coat. So what does that consist of? You'll find, again, the trousers that are worn with the stroller. The most formal trousers, usually a gray striped or checkered trouser, paired with a waistcoat, a dress shirt, and what we see is a morning jacket, or morning coat, pardon me, which is like a tailcoat, except it's a single long cut down to the back. What do you wear around your neck? Usually a necktie, usually gray or black if it's for a funeral. Or Emily Post deemed the ascot worthy of morning dress as well. So the proper hat for this would be a top hat. But if you have a formal affair in the evening, we come to our final and most formal dress, the full evening dress. So this is a white tie affair. If you get an invitation for something that says white tie, this is what you wear. So what does that consist of? You get a white dress shirt with a winged collar. You'll note in the black tie attire, the collar is attached like a standard collared shirt. In the winged collar, it's unattached, so you can see the tie looping completely around the neck with a little tiny little wings at the top of the collar. So that also obviously has a white tie, given the name. You get a white waistcoat and a black tailcoat. So the tailcoat has a cut around the waist that should not drop shorter than the waistcoat. So you should never see the waistcoat, but that's neither here nor there. So what do you wear with this? A top hat, white gloves, a white scarf if you're in the winter, an opera coat as the gentleman is wearing there, opera cloak, silver-topped cane. This is the most formal. You would wear these to opera galas or official things like when the president meets with Her Majesty the Queen, he'll wear white tie attire. This is the pinnacle of formal attire right here. Little bonus, clergy will wear a ferraiolo over their cassock to these. So that's the long black cape with the satin lining of the sort, it's like sort of like lapels, and then there's the fabric tie at the top. So this is the pinnacle of formal attire. So I really hope that you enjoyed that little exposition. There's a lot more to go into, a lot more about the development of these things. But as the clock is running, I just hope you find some nice inspiration to look a little more into this. And I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Noah. Next up, we have Mary, and let's see if I can set her up with co-host status here. There she is. Co-host, yes. Mary, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
And I will spotlight your video. So you should be good to go, and then you can share your screen and start whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Today I'll be speaking about the Maronites, the Catholic Maronite Church. I'm obviously not American nor British, and my first language is not English, so I might be mispronouncing some words. I'm Lebanese, so also the talk will mostly take the perspective of a Lebanese Maronite rather than an expatriate, okay? First of all, the title is very fitting because Maron-who, Maron is our father, the spiritual father of the Maronites. He was a priest and a hermit who lived in the Taurus Mountains in the region of Cyrus, which is Khorush in modern-day Syria. He built churches over non-believers' temples. He was known for his healing abilities, so many people flocked to him. And given the fact that he lived in the 4th century, before any great schisms in the church happened, he is venerated by Catholics and Orthodox alike. There are only 2 known written sources about him. The first one is in the book History of the Selected People of God, which was written by Theodoret, the Bishop of Cyrus, or Theodoros, if you want to pronounce it in Arabic. What he said about him was that he was the first one to live as a hermit in this area. And there was also a letter from Saint John Chrysostom to Maron, the monk priest. And another central figure in the Maronite Catholicism is the okay. Before that, there's Beit Maron. After Saint Maron's death, his relics were the object of considerable interest and conflict. Many people wanted to get their hands on his body. In the end, the people of a neighboring village succeeded in taking it. Then a church was built in his name, and the sarcophagus containing the saint's body was housed in it. It is believed that later the saint's skull was transported by the saint's disciples to Apamea in Syria, where they built the famous Saint Maron monastery, or Beit Maron, around the year 452. You can see where Khorush or Cyrus was and where the monastery was built in this map. After that, the first patriarch of the Maronites is Saint John Maron. He was elected in around the year 652, I think. He was the first 685. He left Beit Maron and settled in Kfar Hay, in the Batroun region of Lebanon at the beginning of the 8th century. He built an altar and a monastery after Saint Maron's name and put Saint Maron's skull inside the altar to heal the faithful. This is why the monastery is called Rish Moran, which is in Syriac Maron's head. As a fun fact, you should know that Maron means the little Lord in Syriac. When we're talking about our Lord Jesus, we say Morio. When we're talking about a saint, we say Mar Maroon in Arabic. The relic was subsequently moved to Italy in the 10th century. However, about 2 years ago, a small piece of it was brought back to be displayed at Kfar Hay. And here you can see what the monastery looks like currently. I've been there many times. It's the seat of our diocese, of our bishop. You can see the outside area, and you can see the church, which is rather small, by the way. It can only hold like 300 people. Obviously, it was destroyed several times and rebuilt, and this is only a modern version, so there's nothing left of the original monastery, unfortunately. Maronite identity. According to the second chapter of the Maronite Patriarchal Assembly, which was held in 2006, and which treats the topic of the identity of the Maronite Church, its vocation and mission, we see in it that the Maronite Church is an Syriac Antiochian church with a special liturgical patrimony. There are obviously many differences from the Latin Church or Latin Rite and from other rites. Antioch is where Christ's followers were called Christians for the first times, and as Maronites, we share an historical, liturgical, and spiritual heritage with all of the other Catholic and Orthodox Antiochian churches. It's also a Chalcedonian church. Maronites were staunch supporters of the Council of Chalcedon, which was convened in 451, which taught that Jesus was true God and true man. And also, the Maronite Church is the only Eastern Rite church to have never been out of communion in Rome. Precisely, one of the reasons was because they followed the Chalcedonian Council from the beginning. In this formula, Maronites found a balance and way of life that placed them forever in the communion of the Universal Church. Furthermore, it's a patriarchal church with an ascetic and monastic characteristic. Saint Maron was a hermit priest. The first Maronites were monks, priests, and laity associated with the monasteries of Saint Maron in the 5th and to 8th centuries. Maronites have a cherished history known for an ascetical life of sacrifice and devotion, and fast was, and to a certain extent still is, very important in the Maronite Church. In the beginnings of our church, most of the liturgical life was lived around monasteries, and the faithful participated in the prayers of the monks, which are the divine office. It's not the same one as with the one you pray in the Latin Church. It's a bit different. It's a lot different, in fact, and a lot of the prayers are inspired or taken from writings from early Eastern Church Fathers, particularly Saint Ephraim the Syrian. We're also a church. Sorry, I forgot something. What you see here is the patriarchal motto of all of the Maronite patriarchs, because we have a patriarch. On left, it's in Latin. It says Gloria Libani data est el. On your right hand, it would be in Syriac. It says Iqorod Libnon netihe bleh. It means the glory of Lebanon was given to him, to the Maronite patriarch, and it is taken from Isaiah and the prophet Ashaya in the Old Testament. Ours is a church in communion with the Apostolic See of Rome, and this relationship has allowed Maronites to fully express the Catholic faith held from the beginning, at the same time be part of the balance between East and West. You can see our patriarch with Pope Francis. It's also a church incarnated in its Lebanese and Eastern environment, and Maronites have played a very important role in Lebanese history. Her spiritual home, Lebanon, is the Maronite Church's spiritual homeland and the land of her patriarch and people. Maronites take great pride in the joint accomplishment of the Muslim-Christian coexistence, which today we call Lebanon. It's also a church existing in countries of expansion, wherever Lebanese Maronites emigrated. There you see Maronite eparchies and dioceses. That's in Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada. I listed them, and there are Maronites in other countries, but they don't have dioceses yet. The picture which you see is from the 2017 World Maronite Youth Days, where we were about 1,000. There was about 1,500 young people aged from 17 years old to 35 years old, and we met in Kirke for several days. We had a lot of activities around our patriarch and learned more about our heritage. Liturgical year. First of all, it's one cycle, not 3. Each year we relive the same cycle. It starts off with the glorious birth of Jesus Christ. Then we have the Epiphany, 3 weeks of commemorations, Lent and Holy Week. Holy Week, there are different colors for Holy Week, while Lent, mostly the priest wears mauve. During the glorious birth, the priest wears white and or gold. Epiphany, red, to to its symbol. During the resurrection, the priest wears gold and white, and also the church is decorated in these colors. During Pentecost, gold and red. During the liturgical season of the Holy Cross, I think also white and or gold. For martyrs' feasts, the color is red. For saints' feasts, white. And for Marian feasts, they can wear blue, but when it's with white. We have the old order of sacraments. Baptism and confirmation are conferred upon birth together. Communion is received at about 8 years old. Reconciliation before communion. Anointing of the sick when everyone is in need. And in the Maronite church, priests can be married as long as they get married before they are ordained deacons. We also kept the minor orders of subdeacon and lector and cantor. We have several saints. I've already spoken about Saint Maron and Saint John Maron. Saint Raf was a nun canonized in 2000 who lived blind and crippled for nearly the last 20 years of her life. She was in the Lebanese Maronite order, which there are two branches, one for men and one for women. Saint Charbel is a very well-known saint all over the church. He is a miracle worker, and I think a few months ago the Vatican announced that there have been the most miracles ever attributed to his intercession. He was a monk and priest who lived the last 23 years of his life as a hermit, and many faithful flock to his old hermitage each year. We also have Saint Amtallah Hardine, who was a monk and a priest in the same order of Saint Charbel. He also taught him. He was his superior. He was canonized in 2004 after his student. Thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry for taking more time than agreed upon. And thank you. I don't know if we have time for any questions.
That was great, Mary. That I have heard of the Maronites before, but had never really known anything about them. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
And if you can DM me any questions.
Yeah, everyone feel free to do that. Reach out to Mary on Twitter. You want to
you.
share your Twitter handle while I get Father Tim set up?
Yes, deal. I just need to figure out how to go.
Okay, there's Father Tim. I will make you a co-host. Father Tim, you should be able to do video now, and I can spotlight you.
All right. Yeah, there we are.
Yep, and we can hear you.
Great.
So, where'd you go? One moment. I'm trying to figure this out. There we go. Okay. And we can see you. So take it away.
Awesome. Welcome to my church. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I wanted to do something beautiful for you all. And so here it is. But let's go ahead and start with a bit of a reflection, a bit of a prayer from our Pope. Just yesterday, we got to witness that beautiful and sobering and profound experience of the Urbi et Orbi blessing. But I just want to start with these words from Pope Francis. Why are you afraid? Have you no faith? Lord, your word this evening strikes us and regards us, all of us. In this world that you love more than we do, we have gone ahead at breakneck speed, feeling powerful and able to do anything. Greedy for profit, we let ourselves get caught up in things and lured away by haste. We did not stop at your reproach to us. We were not shaken awake by wars or injustice across the world, nor did we listen to the cry of the poor or of our ailing planet. We carried on regardless, thinking we would stay healthy in a world that was sick. Now that we are in a stormy sea, we implore you, wake up, Lord. Now, these words are a reflection on one of the most famous scenes in the Gospel of Mark, is Jesus calming the storm at sea. And the way that Pope Francis reflects on it and speaks those words into our culture, into our world right now, you would think that St. Mark wrote his gospel for us. And that's the power of St. Mark's gospel. St. Mark was writing his gospel for perhaps a specific community. That's something that could be debated and has been argued for many centuries. But the way that it still reaches into our church here and now, 2,000 years later, shows the power of Mark's ability to tell a story. You know, just the image of Pope Francis yesterday carrying the monstrance for benediction and seeing there was a moment there where it looked like he was almost going to trip, that he was carrying too great a weight. And to understand the church in that way, the frailty of who we are right now and the weight that's been placed onto our shoulders, the responsibility and the authority to continue to create community in a world that is obsessed with self-isolation and our social distancing. So how do we build that community? But how are we challenged by the gospel that could speak to that moment when Jesus calmed the sea, speak to the moment of the church that Mark was writing to, but also speak into the church 2,000 years later? Well, that's the power of Mark's ability to write as a gospel writer, as an evangelist, was to tell a story that doesn't get stuck in the past. And so to help us understand how he did that, we've got to understand who Mark is a little bit, the best we can tell. There's not a lot of information in the gospel itself that we can consider biographical. And there is a great tradition early in the church that Mark was perhaps the secretary, interpreter, even translator of St. Peter. And so that's where we get so many of the greatest little details in Mark's gospel that are left out in the other synoptic gospels, is that there is, because of this tradition, an assumption that Mark was receiving this information from somebody who was right there at the feet of Jesus, Peter. That's the tradition. It tells us that St. Mark became a follower of Peter and passed on his stories and his traditions. Because of this, we have some of the most colorful details in the stories of Gospels of the Gospel of Mark compared to the other Gospels. And so whom was he writing? He was probably writing to a community in Rome around the year 70 AD or so, which, you know, it's argued, it's debated that the source material came from a long time before that, but that you can tell just by the tensions of the stories that are told that Mark was speaking to a specific community that was struggling with the same things that the disciples struggled with. The gospel presents these images of the disciples as people who are closest to Jesus, who know Jesus the best, but misunderstand him the most and seem to fail at everything they try. If you want to be challenged in your discipleship, go read the Gospel of Mark and see how the disciples who knew Jesus the best and were closest to him failed over and over and over again. You would almost think that Peter was not so much the rock of the church as he was rock-headed. But it's a challenging but encouraging image of what it means to be a disciple of Christ. And this is part of the way that Mark tells the story. He wasn't aiming to be a historian or a biographer so much as perhaps a theologian and an ecclesiologist as well, as telling us who God is and so who the church is. And so one of the main ways that Mark is able to do this as a storyteller and as a theologian is through what we colloquially call the Markan sandwich. The Markan sandwich, in its more technical term, is an intercalation. In a literary sense, an intercalation is when you begin with one story, you seem to get interrupted by another, and then on the other side of that story, you finish the original story. But they're connected in such a way that the middle story, the meat of the sandwich, gives meaning to the bread on the sides. And so the Markan sandwich is one of St. Mark's most creative ways to tell a story, not making it up, telling the biography of a community, but telling Jesus' story so that it strikes at the heart of the community to whom it is being addressed. One of my favorite examples of the Markan sandwich, it comes in chapter 5. It's not the first. There are probably 10, some would say, maybe even 11 incidences where Mark uses this way of telling a story in order to speak the gospel into the community to whom he's writing in Rome, facing tension, facing persecution, and handling it poorly. So in Mark chapter 5, after Jesus has come in from the sea, after having calmed the sea with his word, and after having healed the man who was possessed by a legion of demons, Jesus portraying himself, revealing himself to be the one who controls the uncontrollable. And rather than being brought into town on the arms and the shoulders of the people who have found him victorious, they ask him to leave and to get out of town. Where Jesus ends up after this moment is on the other shore, where Jairus, the synagogue official of the area, comes running to him, falls at his feet, and begs him to come and to heal his daughter who is sick at home. Now, Jesus is willing to be interrupted from wherever he was going, and without hesitation, without asking questions, goes to heal the young girl. But as he's interrupted and going without hesitation, he is interrupted from being interrupted. And while he is gathered, there's a crowd gathered around him. he feels power go out from him. And this woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages and so had been unable to enter into worship with the community of the Jewish people, that she had gone to doctors over and over again. And not only had they not made it better, they only made it worse. But it was falling at the feet of Jesus with faith that brought her healing. And something is revealed about her. She has been suffering for 12 years. Now, Jesus, having healed this woman who has sought him in faith, goes into the house of Jairus, into the house where there is a dead girl, a corpse, which would make him ritually impure. And so he would not be able to go into the worship of the Jewish people. But we know that Jesus's story doesn't end there, that he reaches into death and pulls life out the other side. And so we have the beautiful Talitha Kum and the raising of Jairus's daughter. And another interesting detail is revealed. How old is she? 12 years old. And so there is an intimate connection between the stories of this young girl who has died and been brought back to life, and the woman who's suffered at the hands of doctors and at the hand of maybe even Jairus, knowing this woman saying, you can't enter into worship because of your hemorrhages. So we have this intimate connection, and the symbolism has been expressed that the woman who has suffered from the hemorrhages is ancient Israel, that has sought out healing in military alliances, in political treaties, in other gods, in false gods. But it not only has it not made it better, it's made it worse. And all Israel needs to do is fall at the feet of Jesus to receive healing. The young girl, hidden away and frightened, and then ultimately dead, but needing to be brought back to life, is the new Israel, the church established by Christ, but hiding away, perhaps in these Roman churches that Mark is writing to, with every opportunity to proclaim Christ, but failing to do so because of their fear. They are a dead young community. So Mark is telling them through the way that he puts these stories together, you are dead, you need Christ to come back and to bring you back to life. Now, another beautiful example of the Markan sandwich comes just a chapter later, when Jesus sends out his apostles with his own authority to cast out demons, to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to forgive sins. But you would think that immediately after that, we would have an opportunity to hear about some of these adventures. But we are interrupted by the story of St. John the Baptist's martyrdom, his beheading in prison, this great herald of the gospel who wanted to follow Jesus, but was put into prison and probably praying, I've been waiting for a savior, and I proclaimed him, where is my savior? But St. John, accepting that martyrdom, and then afterwards, the disciples come back and proclaim everything that Jesus had done through them. And we have Mark telling the community, look, no matter how powerful you are in working miracles and working healing and proclaiming the gospel, it doesn't matter unless you have the love and the faith that took St. John into the prison and to his own death. And so Markan sandwiches are a way to gather together the material that Mark had received from Peter and to tell the story in such a way that it is fresh and it is new for the community that he's writing to and our church as well. So we can receive the stories of St. Mark's gospel, understanding that they were written for us. They speak into our lives, and they're meant to call us out of the self-isolation and the temptation towards isolation that we face these days, and to bring healing to the world. All right, thank you all.
Thank you, Father Tim. That was awesome. I love the Gospel of Mark, so that was really eye-opening for me in a couple of ways. So I'd never heard some of that stuff before. Up next, we have Sunglass Pre, and I'm really excited about this talk, and maybe once we get going, you'll see why. Let's see if I can find her here. There she is. Okay, I'm gonna make you a co-host, and you should be able to share your video now. And I will spotlight it. There we go. Say something, see if we can hear you.
Hey guys.
There we go. All right, take it away.
All right, let me go ahead and start this real fast. All right. Can you guys see that okay? Is that sharing?
It is not sharing.
All right, let me get this figured out.
Okay.
Okay, oh, there we go. Okay, so share.
Oh, there we go.
Aha.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. So, hi. So I'm Sarah. I go by Sunglass Pre on Twitter. And I'm talking about kaiju today because it's a very, very big interest of mine. In case you guys don't know me on Twitter, I am a science teacher by day. My background is in biology, earth sciences, which I currently teach for high school, and also religious studies. I actually have a degree in it, which is a lot easier for me to say rather than I went to Catholic school for 12 years. So But I'm also the resident embarrassing weeaboo of Catholic Twitter. If you don't know the meme, weeaboo just means that I'm really into Japanese media, anime, manga, and specifically what I'm going to talk about today, giant monsters. So what is a kaiju? A kaiju in this sense literally means strange beast. It denotes a specific live action genre of film or TV that focuses on monster fights. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as daikaiju, the dai in this sense meaning great. So it focuses specifically on giant monsters. And when I say kaiju or giant monsters, probably the first thing you guys think of is Godzilla. And for really good reason. This is generally considered the start of the genre and widespread use of the term. Back in 1954. I thought I had the date wrong there for a second. Now, some of you guys may have seen the original movie. Some of you may have heard about it, but generally it's not something that most people are familiar with, which I think is a shame because it's had a really huge impact on science fiction in general. But I also really like giant monsters in general for a reason that is very specific to Catholic faith. So first of all, when we talk about kaiju from their very beginnings with Godzilla have a very specific allegorical nature, and that is they represent natural disasters. So these can either be random or caused by human impacts. So fires, floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, coronavirus plagues, bad stuff that happens seemingly for no reason or because we screwed up somewhere along the way. And in the same way, kaiju themselves are these giant unstoppable forces of nature, and they can either be caused by just random events, they just pop out of the mountain and start stomping around, or because like humans have been meddling around where they shouldn't have. And this is very clearly illustrated in the original movie. Godzilla himself is an ancient underwater creature that was awakened by a nuclear bomb test. And then throughout the movie, we see Godzilla's destruction actually exacerbated by a botched bureaucratic attempt to try and capture him to study him for science. So in that way, Godzilla himself sort of serves as like an avenger of nature to rise up and reprimand humanity for their sins. And we see that also show up in a lot of other Godzilla movies throughout its history. In fact, the most recent one in 2016, Shin Godzilla actually was made specifically by director Hideaki Anno to address the failings of what he perceived from the Japanese government in response to the 2011 earthquake and the Fukushima nuclear power plant meltdown. So Godzilla is continuously used in this sense, but this isn't the only time when we see, you know, giant ancient beings that represent chaos opposed to humanity. One of the ones that you guys are probably most familiar with is the concept of the Leviathan. And this comes, probably the oldest use of it comes from the book of Job. So if we look in Job chapter 3, immediately after Job loses everything, his family, his health, his livelihood, all of his wealth is destroyed. And in his lament, one of the things that he mentions is the Leviathan. So it's kind of appropriate that he uses sort of the symbol of chaos and destruction, that he invokes it to represent the tragedy that he is experiencing right now. It also shows up later in the book in chapter 40, where God specifically charges Job to criticize or hold him accountable for his actions. And Job instead speaks about the mighty powers of God, how his creation lies so far above human control and understanding. And again, he uses this sense of the Leviathan in the same way. So it's very easy to substitute Leviathan with Godzilla and picture things in very similar ways. But that kind of brings about a paradox, because if Leviathan is part of God's creation, why does Leviathan exist? Why would God make something that specifically cannot be controlled or that lies outside of human understanding if Adam was intended to be steward of all things on creation? So that sort of brings us back around to the allegorical nature of kaiju as natural disasters. What purpose do natural disasters serve in God's creation? You know, why do fires and floods happen? Why did Job's family die all in a freak accident? Why did he lose everything? Why do we lose everything in our lives? So there's two different ways that we address this conflict that we call the problem of evil. One that a lot of kaiju movies focus on is that bad things happen to people because man is inherently fallen. So again, Godzilla was originally woken up by a nuclear bomb test. And in fact, I forgot to mention this earlier, the director of the original 1954 Godzilla, Ishiro Honda, actually specifically filmed a lot of the scenes of destruction in Tokyo to mimic the fallout from the nuclear blast from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it is specifically intended to be anti-nuclear weapons to show the destruction that that sort of warfare causes. But another one that I'm going to focus on for the second half of my talk is that God allows things to happen so that we might better understand his mighty deeds. And I mean, giant monsters are fundamentally cool. You got Godzilla stomping around Tokyo. I mean, it looks awesome. You have giant monsters fighting for her. It looks cool. It's a way for us to understand the power of God through his creations in that sense. But we can also see God's grace and God's mighty deeds expressed in other people's actions. And sometimes those can be done through the actions of the kaiju themselves. So over the history of the franchise, Godzilla is not always just a force of destruction. Sometimes he is an avenger that protects the earth from other threats that are more explicitly demonic in nature, that is fundamentally opposed to God's creation. And sometimes he even serves as a superhero. This is from Godzilla versus Megalon. Highly recommended. There's a Mystery Science Theater episode on it, which you can find. It is amazing. I mean, just look at this. How can you not love this movie? But the idea of sort of the power of God's deeds being worked through something unexpected, that is being kaiju themselves, actually started before Godzilla started doing it, although there is still a connection there with the franchise. And those of you who follow me on Twitter probably know where this is going. So this dude here in the fedora is Eiji Tsuburaya. He was the special effects director on the original Godzilla movie and through much of the classic films that Toho produced. For the purposes of my presentation, he also is a Catholic convert, so that makes a lot of these connections I'm about to make a little bit more obvious. So in 1963, he went and founded his own production studio, and he wanted specifically to focus on taking kaiju stories and putting them on TV. Now, at that time, the television was still relatively new in most people's households. So it was a new piece of technology that he wanted to take advantage of to deliver these stories to a lot of individuals, families, especially children. And so when he presented these stories, there's two different ways that he started. One of those ways reflects a lot of the original Godzilla themes, and that's in Ultra Q in 1966. So it's actually out on Blu-ray. It's a very, very good science fiction series. It's also very clearly inspired by the Twilight Zone. And again, it focuses on how the fallen nature of humanity sort of upsets or unbalances the natural order of things. And so just like Godzilla, we have the unknown, which rises up against human civilization and threatens it, you know, when we do things that we're not supposed to. You know, the saying, God reprimands those who he loves. But again, those of you who follow me on Twitter probably know what I'm going to talk about. While Ultra Q was airing, Tsuburaya and his studio conceived of a new spin on the kaiju boom, not as an idea as a kaiju as a destructive monster, but a moral heroic figure. And so that became Ultraman, which aired later that year, again in 1966. And cool thing, has actually been running fairly continuously since then. So it's a very cool series for a number of different reasons. But you'll notice maybe at the top of the slide, the reason why I'm mentioning it here is this concept of view catastrophe. So throughout this whole presentation, I wanted to be talking about how the idea of the problem of evil is addressed. Why do destructive, awful things happen to people? Well, Tolkien thought of this idea too, and he said that in a lot of these stories, we have a moment where we take a tragedy and it suddenly, surprisingly turns into joy. And he sees that as sort of the ultimate goal of all what he called fairy stories. In this case, fantastic stories intended to tell a specific truth about the world. So what better fantastic story than a giant alien monster coming from space and beating up other monsters? And, you know, that truth is powerful because it ultimately reflects what he called the true myth, and that's the death and resurrection of Jesus. So the greatest story ever told. And we see that format continuously throughout Ultraman, especially in the first episode. So the events of the show start off with Ultraman accidentally crashing a giant monster into Earth, falls in a lake, he kills a guy in the process, Shin Hayata, who's a pilot. And so we think that this is some sort of disastrous first contact scenario and that lots of people are going to die. And then startlingly, it turns into a joyous occasion because instead of dying, Hayata is revived and actually given the powerful Ultraman to fight to defeat Bemlar, who's the spiky dude there to the right. So again, we have this idea of self-sacrifice. We have this idea of death and resurrection, very Christian themes that go through all throughout the franchise. Oops. So I don't know how I'm doing on time because I can't see the chat menu right now. But in conclusion, the reason why I wanted to talk about kaiju movies, I think it's especially pertinent in this time, is that the purpose of kaiju movies and these giant monsters in the first place is to test us, just as Job was tested. So we can see them as a leviathan that is intended to destroy, to reprimand us when we sin, to, you know, punish humanity for that original sin. But those kaiju are still part of God's creation. They still serve a fundamental purpose. So not all of them are specifically evil, and we shouldn't treat them like that. The challenge for us as Christians, as it did with Job, is in our response to that evil. You know, how do we actually address these natural disasters? Do we react in fear or hatred or abandon or deny God? Or do we accept the grace of God and use those opportunities to unite our suffering with Jesus? And throughout any of these kaiju stories, whether I'm talking about Godzilla or Gamera or Ultraman or what have you, anytime that humans react with the latter, with fear and hatred, it makes things worse. But it's by embracing those better graces that come through God that we turn things into that eucatastrophe, that joyous occasion instead. So they ultimately test us in the same way that we're always tested, just on a much grander scale. So that exaggeration, I feel, makes it that much more obvious to see how God's grace works through these events. So in conclusion, God is in control. That's my talk. Yay. I don't know how I'm doing on time, so if anybody has questions.
That was perfect. Thank you, Sarah. That was right on time.
Yeah. Awesome.
And I I loved that, but I might be a little biased because I'm also a resident weeaboo on Catholic Twitter, so I was very much looking forward to hearing that.
Yeah,
That was very fascinating.
I had to bring my mug.
Oh, very nice, very nice. All right, who's up next here? Not really. Achola? I don't think I follow you on Twitter, so I need to figure out who you are. Let's see. Gotta go through all my settings here. It's Kateri. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hunter. Where is she here? I see Kopwa is in the chat. Welcome, Kopwa. Hello. Kateri, there you are. Okay, we'll make you a co-host. Kateri, you can share your screen now, and I will unmute you.
And can you guys see me and hear me?
Video. There you are. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
We're good.
You can also see me?
Yes, I can see you. So take it away whenever you want. If you want to share your screen, you can do that too.
I don't want to share my screen.
Okay, then we're just gonna enjoy this. All right, take it away.
Great. Okay. Hey everybody, my name is Kateri, as far as you know, and today we're going to be talking about the poet, lyricist, scholar, prodigy, lesbian, maybe, Juana Inés de la Cruz, who was actually born Juana Inés de Asbaja y Ramírez de Santillana, because that's how Spanish names go. Now, throughout this talk, I do want to apologize, first of all, if you hear any snoring or yawning. It is my dog. He has nothing meaningful to contribute. He just really snores loudly. So Juana Inés is incredibly interesting because she's a lot of things to a lot of people. If you may have noticed, to me, she is my display name on Twitter, which is very funny to me because a lot of people end up not knowing who she is, and then thinking that I am Juana Inés. My name is Juana. It's not. I'm also not Mexican. Okay, let's get into it. So Juana Inés was born in what is currently Mexico. At the time, it was New Spain, and she was born near what today is Mexico City. She was a criolla, which is a Spanish person and a half Spanish and half indigenous person have a child. So not super top, because the Spaniards in every place they conquered were always at the very tippy top of the hierarchy, but pretty up there, pretty well off. And so I mentioned prodigy. She was a prodigy. She hid in the chapel of her grandfather's estate, and she would read books from his library, which at the time, female education was not encouraged, shall we say. So by certain sources, she had learned to read and write in Latin by age 3. She could do math by age 5. And at age 8, she wrote a poem about the Eucharist. As a teenager, she was already good at Greek logic, like how the Greeks, had that whole system. And by age 13, she was teaching Latin to other kids. And she also learned Nahuatl, which is the Aztec language. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Nahuatl, but it is a nightmare. It's beautiful. It's a nightmare. But she learned it, and she also wrote some poems in that language. So when she was a teenager, she went into Mexico City. Remember, she was born on the outskirts. And she really wanted to enter the university, but only men were allowed into the university. So she asked her mother if she could disguise herself as a man, and of course her mother was like, no. What? But Juana was pretty determined to continue her studies anyway. So she became a lady-in-waiting at the court of the Viceroy, which is like I think that translates to like little king. So it's basically the person who was in charge of New Spain, and his wife, the Vicereina, which I don't know how to say that in Spanish. I mean in English. Just say, little queen. Can you hush? Thank you. So she was so smart that when she was 17 years old, the Viceroy realized how smart she was. So he invited a bunch of theologians, a bunch of lawyers, philosophers, poets, a bunch of learned scholars, essentially. Of course, all of them were male. That was the time. To kind of a trial, almost, in which she proved her intelligence against all of them. And it was incredible. A lot of people proposed marriage to her, which she denied. Yeah. So there are varying speculations as to why she actually entered religious life, and we'll get into those in a minute. But what we know for sure is that in the 1660s, she entered a discalced Carmelite monastery, and she was only there a few months. And then later she entered with the Yeronomitas. Now, Yeronomitas, as far as I can tell, still exist, but they are only present in Spain and India. And they translate to Yeronomites, which is not a word, but they're the Order of St. Jerome. Currently, they're all cloistered. At the time, they were somewhat cloistered. She entered with the Yeronomitas because they had more relaxed rules than the discalced Carmelites, who were pretty strict. And like I said, this is where a lot of the speculation kicks in. There are, tens of hundreds of scholars called Sorbanistas that write exclusively about her and her life and her impact on Mexico and on the world, not so much on the church. There's been a lot of thought about why she's not recognized by the church, and the general consensus is she's a little bit too uppity to have been a saint. Now, why she joined the convent, like I said, we're not really sure. There are a lot of theories. One of the most popular ones is that of, people bring up also for famous saints like St. Hildegard of Bingen, that in a world where women could basically only get married, joining a monastery or a convent gave you a measure of freedom that you didn't have in the wider world. And for her, that freedom was utilized to continue to study, continue to read, and especially because so much of her interest was theological, there were certainly no absence of materials in a monastery. So another theory that I personally am not super sure about is that she was a closeted lesbian and enjoyed being in a convent, living with a lot of other women in community. I am not personally sure about this. Like I said, there's a lot of scholarly thought about this. I think it's important to remember that our current notions of gender and sexuality don't perfectly map onto the past. So even if Juana herself might have been a lesbian or had lesbian tendencies, she would not call it that, and she would probably not identify herself as such. However, whatever the case was, she entered the Hieronymite monastery and she thrived. She became friends by pen pals with a lot of scholars, very well-known, great minds of New Spain, which was really early Mexico. And so she was cloistered in her convent, and the viceroy and vicereina from earlier, the guy that brought all these smart people and put her on trial, were her patrons. So they supported her financially, and they had her writings published over in Spain. So she wrote a lot of poetry. She wrote philosophical treatises. She wrote like hymns, like I said. There was her very early poems to the Eucharist. This is where things start to get bad. So in, I think, 1690, the Bishop of Puebla, took a critique that she had written. So Juana had written a critique of a very old sermon by a Portuguese Jesuit. And the bishop had an intention to denounce that priest. So he took her work, published it under a fake name, and was like, hey, everything in this is really good and true, but also you're a woman, so you should shut up. You should devote yourself to prayer, and you should give up your writing. And so Juana said, what am I here for then? So she wrote a response to the pseudonym, which was Sor Filotea. So she wrote a very famous response where she defended women's rights to formal education. She wanted women to be able to write, to be able to publish their writing. She essentially wanted women to be placed in a position where they could educate other women. And then she also argued, because again, she was a product of her time, that could avoid potentially dangerous situations with male teachers and young female students. So she was quite controversial. I realized it's funny because in doing this research, I was like, none of this seems particularly crazy, but you have to remember for this time, it was huge. She managed to do all of this from inside a cloister. So in response to this, the Archbishop of Mexico condemned her waywardness, and she was forced to do penance. There is a penitential document that she wrote out and signed, Yo la peor de todas, which means I'm the worst of all. You can argue that the Todas means I the worst of all women. I'm not really sure. Either way, it was very dramatic and very on board. So sources are kind of unclear as to whether she, obeying the bishop's orders, sold all of her books and instruments and like musical instruments, scientific instruments, or whether the bishop and his people had to come and confiscate them. So out of over like hundreds of works that she wrote, only a few have survived. I think probably her most famous is called Los Hombres Necios, which is an entire poem denouncing how men think of women and expect them to act. This has led to a lot of people calling her a proto-feminist, because again, much like I said about homosexuality, she wouldn't have those terms and she wouldn't know what to do with them. So a lot of Mexican scholars have argued that Mexicano, a lot of Mexican scholars have argued that she had what we would today call feminist beliefs, in that she believed in a woman's autonomous right to be educated, a woman's right to educate others, and in terms of the church, a woman's right to study theology, philosophy, history, canon law, and to educate themselves and to educate others on the faith, which unfortunately, 400 years later, is something we still struggle with. So Juana Inés is kind of an interesting figure in Mexico. They've kind of picked her up as an icon of national pride. She's on the 200 peso bill. I don't have a 200 peso bill to show you because I can't find it. I don't carry Mexican money generally. But she's on the 200 peso bill. There are a lot of pictures of her, a lot of important things named after her. But she's really more a part of Mexican history, Mexican intellectual history, than she is a part of Catholic history. And I think that's wrong, because she was, by all accounts, a faithful nun, whatever her reasons for entering the convent may have been, which, again, we'll never know. And one of her biggest goals was to be able to have women properly educated, especially in our faith. And so I think that's an incredible legacy, and I wish more people knew about her. So what you have just witnessed is my very poor attempt to help with that. Like I said, there's a whole body of work out there. They're called Sorbanistas, the scholars that study her. And it's fascinating, but we unfortunately just don't have time to go into it. So, yo, la peor de todas, signing off.
Thank you. That was awesome. Love to learn about revolutionary women in the church, whether they've been well studied or not. Do you want to drop your Twitter handle in the chat so people can follow you if they've got
will
questions?
do that. Yes.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna do some little technical things here first.
Not really a chola. I realize my look today does not do much to disabuse you of that notion, but that is my Twitter account.
All right, let's see here. I'm going to revoke your co-host status. I'm sorry. Bye, Kateri.
Bye.
And then up next we have at Emma Rose Patrick. So Emma, let me find you here and I will set you up. Emma Rose, there you are. Spotlight video. Make co-host. Okay, you should be able to unmute and share your screen now.
Hello, beautiful. Thank you for joining us. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, but yeah, I just wanted to chat a little bit. Hello. Hi, Kateri. I see you in the chat. That's so cute. Yeah, so today I'm going to be giving a little bit of a talk / testimony / analysis on John 11:35, and let's just get into it. You see, I'm turning in my Bible. I have the NAB St. Joseph edition, my favorite. The footnotes are great. We are in chapter 11 of John, and I'm just going to start at verse 32. So this is the story of the raising of Lazarus. I'm sure you all have heard it. And yeah, so here we go. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her weeping, he became perturbed and deeply troubled and said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Sir, come and see." And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." So those were verses 32 through 36 of the 11th chapter of the book of John, the Gospel of John. And I really want to focus on verse 35. It's only 3 words. In some translations of the Bible, it's only 2 words. The shortest verse in the entire Bible that I am aware of. And Jesus wept. And I was assigned a paper for my sacred scripture class at my university. I am a student in Ave Maria University in Florida. I'm currently home in Metro Detroit now. But yeah, so I had this paper assigned, and we had to cover 3 components. Like we had to pick any verse from the Bible, just 1 verse, and talk about how it impacts my life, how it impacts the class, and like the content that we've been covering, and how it impacts the world. And I really want to just focus a little bit on analysis, but then a lot of it on the impact on the world and the impact that this verse has had personally on me. For this class, I've also been using this book. It's called Holy People, Holy Land. It's a theological introduction to the Bible. I quite enjoy it. It's by my professor and advisor, Dr. Michael Dauphiné, and his colleague, Matthew Levering. And I love this book. I love the author. Probably one of the most intelligent and kind men I've ever met in my entire life. Bless. But yeah, so I'll be using this. The 7th chapter is on the Gospel of John, and I'm going to read just a short quote from page 168 of this book, Holy People, Holy Land. It says, throughout the history of the Old Testament, as we have seen, God showed his desire to reverse the disharmony in humankind caused by sin, and to dwell intimately again in a relationship of love with his people. So when we know about God's identity as the supreme being, the creator of the universe, the Alpha and the Omega, all of these I am statements that the Lord makes throughout the Bible, we ask ourselves, why did he come down here? Why did he humble himself? Why would he come down to dwell with us? And this quote that I read from this book, this analysis of the book of John in this chapter, kind of really like puts it into the perfect words. God showed his desire to reverse the disharmony in humankind caused by sin. And why did he come down? To dwell intimately again in a relationship of love with his people. And I have seen the demonstration of this radical, reckless love by our God in this verse, John 11:35, and Jesus wept. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about that, but very quickly, because I'm looking at my clock in the corner of my laptop screen, and we're like a little bit short on time. But like we can analyze this verse in many different lenses. One that I just want to touch on really quick is the in the literary sense, because it's only 3 words and 2 words in some translations, as I previously mentioned. It grabs your attention. Like I took AP Lang in high school, and like one of the the literary devices, like the rhetorical devices that we had to learn and study was short sentence. And it just indicates the importance that the author, John the Evangelist, or one of his editors is trying to convey here. Like Jesus wept. And we only hear about Jesus weeping in one other place in the Bible. It's in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, verse 41. As he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it. This is Jesus drawing close to Jerusalem. The Lament for Jerusalem is the title of this section for me. And both of these verses, but particularly this verse in John 11, demonstrate like the humanity and the love and the understanding of suffering that Jesus has for us. Like in our world currently, like Catholics are dealing with, especially in the United States, are dealing with the suspension of public masses. We know this. And like this involuntary fast from the Eucharist due to coronavirus and, you know, trying to protect the herd, as it were. And this verse like explains it all for me. Like Jesus gets it, and like we are allowed to feel sad about the fact that we won't be able to receive our Lord in the Eucharist for a while, and like that's okay. Like we know that Jesus is going to rise again. Like in this chapter of John, like just a few chapters later, Jesus is crucified, and then a few chapters after that, he rises from the dead. And so like Jesus knows that this is going to happen, but he still acknowledges the hurt and the pain and the human suffering that happens here, and he embraces it, and he grieves, and he, you know, really demonstrates like what it is to grieve together as a church. You know, grieve together with his friends, these people who have been like family to him in Bethany, and like that's okay. Like we can like be sad. Like I have been home for like a week or 8 days. I've been home for 8 days, and so the diocese that Ave is in is one of the last or was one of the last dioceses in the country to suspend public masses. So we were all hanging on, like the third of the student body that was left that hadn't left yet was like, okay, we're staying for Jesus. We're staying for Jesus. We can still like go to mass and adoration. And they announced it. We were all like, no, and we were so sad. And so last Thursday was the last day of public masses. So at 8 p.m., like our regular 8 p.m. Campus mass, we had on the academic lawn. It was packed, and then we adored our Lord until the 11 p.m. This is a special 11 p.m. vigil mass for Friday. So we were able to, you know, receive our Lord for that Friday, that next day that mass was suspended at. And like we were all, not all of us, many of us, including me, were like ugly crying and, you know, like hugging our friends and like saying goodbye to people. And this is especially emotionally taxing for me because I'd only decided a few hours prior that I was going to pack up all my stuff, store everything, and fly home to Detroit the next day. And so like a lot to process emotionally, and like already having it in my head that this is the verse that I was going to focus on for this paper, the verse that I was going to focus on for this talk, was such a comfort to me. Like, it's okay to be sad. Like, we're okay. Like, it's okay to be sad. Like, not even just in this corona situation, but like with, you know, like losing family members and, you know, getting fired from your job, anything, depression, anxiety, things that, you know, don't seem to have a cause beyond a chemical imbalance in your brain. Like, it's okay to be upset. You know, like we recognize that our Lord is coming. He has already come. He continually offers himself for us. But like, it's okay to acknowledge those emotions. I just want to close with a few sentences on this verse. As I was flying home last Friday on the plane, I was like starting to prepare for this paper for this talk, and I was just asking the Lord, like, what do you want me to say? And like, what do you want to tell them? What do you want to tell them? And this is what he said to me to tell to you. He said, "Do not be afraid or intimidated by me. I love you, and I would do it all over again, just for you personally, for you individually." And so I just want to leave you with that. Do not be afraid. It's okay to like acknowledge those feelings and to grieve with our church and to support each other in this time, and like acknowledge that sadness, not invalidate it, but like have faith, like have hope in the Lord. Like, do not be afraid or intimidated by him. Like he will come again, and he loves you, and he would do it all over again just for you personally, you individually. So with that, I will sign off and turn it over to the next person. I hope you all enjoyed it. Feel free to send me any DMs, questions, comments, prayer requests. My handle is @EmmaRosePatrick. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thank you, Emma. That was awesome. I also find a lot of comfort in that verse from John that Jesus wept. So yeah, I related to that quite a bit. All right. Who are we handing it over to next? Let me remind myself. Love Cryption, where are you in this call? Akira, okay. I will make you a co-host. Should be able to share your screen now.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hear you just fine.
All right.
And let me... Oh, are you starting up your video?
1 second. Just trying to get...
No problem.
Trying to get the screen to a point where... Okay, I also have a multi-monitor set up, so I'm not exactly sure. Do I get to pick the screen that I share?
I think so.
Here we go. Okay, I do get to share the screen. Okay, here we go. All right. Can you all see the screen?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, sweet. Well,
do your thing.
Thank you all for having me, everybody. I was very surprised that you just let any old person come in and volunteer. And I've also been very entertained and edified by the talks that I've seen just far. I wish I could have seen more of them, but I had completely different like group podcast thing like just the previous hour. So my presentation is about the language Toki Pona. And I am the kind of person who, I guess I don't have that much time to get into this sort of thing. I've been obsessed with this thing lately, and whenever I'm obsessed with a thing, I don't really have much say in whether, like, what the thing is that I'm obsessed with. There's just some quality about certain things that makes me obsessed with them. Immediately prior to Toki Pona, I was obsessed with Quenya, the Tolkien's language. And, I think we all kind of like J.R. Tolkien here. But the thing that made me upset, or at least it was a tragic beauty of Quenya, is that it wasn't actually finished. Like you can't actually speak it in the way that you can speak a real like a language that has a dictionary for arrow, a dictionary word for arrow as well as a dictionary word for bow, right? And we just don't know all the grammar that was there, and maybe until more of his works are published, we won't ever have those things. And then I looked at the contemporary community for Quenya and Sindarin, and I saw that a lot of the things that people are doing to the languages are kind of coping with the fact that the languages are incomplete. And I'm sorry if that offends anybody who speaks the language. I didn't research the languages enough to form my own opinion on that, but I took the opinion of somebody else who had studied Tolkien's descriptions of the languages extensively, and then studied the way that the conlang community was using them currently. And so according to that person's opinion, the current use of Quenya does not necessarily match one-to-one with Tolkien's vision for it. So I kind of put that aside, and then I learned by chance about something called Toki Pona, which literally means talking good. Okay, so what is Toki Pona? It is a micro-language which a woman named Sonia Lang made first in 2001 when she was suffering some severe depression. And she had the idea that maybe if she could just think about her own thoughts and herself and the world differently with what she was using to describe them, she might be able to overcome the depression that she was feeling by hijacking what some of you may know, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that the structure of a language affects its speaker's worldview or cognition, and thus people's perceptions are relative to their spoken language. Now, leaving aside whether or not this is true, and most linguists don't actually believe the strong version of this. They say, well, okay, maybe in some sense it does happen, but it's not like people who speak Chinese literally cannot conceive of ideas that English speakers can conceive of. However, as an exercise, it was somewhat effective, as we can see. It's also published as a book in 2014. The book has a word in the language, which is just pu, which is kind of funny. And in the book, which is about 160-ish pages, only 51 of those pages are actual teaching text, and they're not very dense either. So Toki Pona has quickly become famous both for how simple it is, how profound it is, and how fast it is to learn. Sonia took some inspiration from Taoism and minimalism in general. I haven't looked too much into either of those things, but I think that the end result is something thoroughly enjoyable and edifying to practice. Explaining my subtitle really quickly, really the only relevance that Urbit has to any of this is this. Urbit is a computer system designed with several very small components at the very bottom level, and everything else in that system is built out of pieces in that very small system. So it's using minimalism to construct an entire computer architecture down from the very core, the hardware, to the user level software that we face. So one of the problems with modern day computers is the hardware works in one way, the software works in another way, and the operating systems work in a third way. And so kind of migrating between all these different dialects of the way that things go results in converting and deconverting and reconverting and a lot of data overhead, which is why Moore's law has kind of flattened out recently, is because the way that we do computing is just not compatible with physics at smaller levels. So the core function of Urbit consists of little enough code to readably fit on a t-shirt. Same can be said for the vocabulary of Toki Pona. They both achieve complexity through building layers upon layers of Lego bricks of minimalist meaning. Before we move on, let's talk about how you write Toki Pona. Those of you who are familiar with IPA will be overjoyed to find out that Toki Pona uses IPA to write its sounds. So as speakers of English, we are privileged in that the letters that represent these sounds are also the sounds that show up in English. So it is written literally as it is spoken, with some minor asterisks on the vowels here, because English has something like 25 vowels and Toki Pona has only 5. And when I say vowels, I mean vowel sounds. I don't mean literally A, E, I, O, U. I mean what the word A can be. It can be ah, it can be ah, it can be a, right, which is actually a diphthong. Toki Pona, however, only has a, e, u, o, right? And anyway, let's not get too tied up in the linguistics. There's just not a lot of complexity in the writing system. The grammar of Toki Pona, accordingly, it is very simple. We have nouns, verbs, adjectives, preverbs, otherwise known as auxiliary verbs. So I am trying to walk, right? Am trying to, well, trying to, in that case, is the auxiliary verb there. Prepositions and particles. We'll get into those later. The order of words is important, like English. It's not like Latin, where you can kind of have words in a variety of different combinations and things will mean the same thing. And so the way that it gets around having so few words is that it marks what the parts of speech are with particles. Because really any word in Toki Pona can be a noun, a verb, or an adjective. And this is where the kind of the fun part comes in. Actually, I guess we'll get to that in a little bit. So here are a few simple sentences. Yan li moku. The person ate or eats or will eat. Toki Pona has no concept of tense in their verbs. If you want to specify the time in which something happened, that's a more complex structure. Mi sitelen. I wrote, or I write, or I will write. Waso li moli e soweli li. The bird kills the small animal. I'm a fan of falcons. We'll get into what li and e mean later. So, sorry, yan is person. Moku is eat. Li is just telling us that the person is doing something. Mi kama sona e Toki Pona. I learn Toki Pona. And Toki, meaning speech. Pona, meaning good. So Toki Pona, literally the name means the language of good, which is Sonia's name for her language. Yes, getting into what do I mean by any word can be a noun, verb, or adjective. Well, since there are only 120 or 125 words in Toki Pona, adding modifiers to them is how you make them more specific. So in English, we say the big orange cat. In Toki Pona, you say soeli suli yelo loye. So sueli means a mammal, suli, big, yellow, and loye, red. So you can see there's this kind of like an inside-out way of modifying the word animal to mean a big animal, to mean a yellow animal, to mean a red, yellow, big animal, which is how red, yellow is like an orange. And also you can see the adjectives come after the noun, as opposed to in English where the adjectives come before the noun. And this is kind of what I mean when you build up meaning by chaining lots of more general meanings together. And this is how it kind of relates to what Urbit is. And obviously, there's no specific word for cats. You can't have a specific word for cat when you have only 120 words to work with. If we wanted to emphasize that the animal was specifically a cat, we would have to find some way to denote what uniquely makes a cat a cat. So for example, if you wanted to talk about, well, a cat is an animal that lives in a house, you could say soeli tomo, where tomo is house. So a house animal. Unfortunately, this could also mean dog or just pet in general. So if you wanted to specifically talk about a cat, then you have a different problem. But this is kind of the fun part of Toki Pona is if you have context, right? If you're at home with your wife and you say, the cat's meowing, you could just say soeli limu. Like there's no other soeli you could be talking about there. So context does a lot of heavy lifting in Toki Pona. Now we've seen li a few times. What is li for? Some words are particles, which means they do not contain meaning themselves. Rather, they organize the meaning within sentences. They form part of the sentence. So we saw something like this earlier. Soeli suli li moku, the big animal, and then the word li, eats. There's also no word for the in Toki Pona. I'm just writing that in English. Li here separates the subject of the sentence from the verb phrase. So when you see li, you know that everything that came before it is a subject, and everything that comes after it is a verb. Miye, which is man, li lape, which is sleep, the man sleeps. And the one exception to this is when you're just talking about only you or only me, you do not need li. So mi moku, I eat or drink. Sinapona, you are good, or you are simple, or you are restorative. Yes, all of those things are pona. The corresponding word ike, bad, also means complicated, which tells you a lot about the design of Toki Pona. What is e for? I think I'll skip this one because I only have a minute left. Here is the Hail Mary, which I wrote in Toki Pona. Yan melio con sewi li suli insasina, wan sewi li pokasina, lon melila, wan sewi li pona esina. Ki li pona pi insasina li sewi Yesu. Yan meli sewi o, mama pi yan sewi o, lon tempo nila, lon tempo pi moli mi mutila, o toki tawa wan sewi tan mi mute yan ike, awen. So I have the literal English translation on the side here. Hilariously, or perhaps providentially, The word Meli in Toki Pona means woman, because in the actual pidgin language Tokpisin, which is spoken in, I think, Indonesia or Malaysia maybe, the word Mewi means female because it came from the English word Mary, who obviously is the most blessed among women. So in a very funny way, as I was writing this, I said, well, Meli is how you would write Mary in the phoneticization of Toki Pona. So it was fitting that the Hail Mary would be the first thing that I would really translate and try to get out there. And there's a couple ways to write Toki Pona, and I'll get through it with my last minute here. This is the Hail Mary that we just saw, using the Sitilen writing system invented by Jonathan Gable. It's based on the Mayan writing system. And the first example of Toki Pona that I ever saw was Sitilen. And it inspired me. Well, it's what immediately got me obsessed with it. And you can see the symbols here. Each one is a word. Each one contains things. But this one specifically, I want to point out in the middle here on the left, the middle on the bottom left, that's the word Yan. But I've embellished it with the Sacred Heart and a cross halo, because that phrase, Yan Sevi Yesu, is obviously referring to Jesus. So you can do a lot of really cool stuff with the hieroglyphic language. So how do you learn it? There are a ton of different resources on it because people keep speaking it and wanting more people to use it. So if these slides are available, which I hope they are, you can click these links and get to at least 3 different ways to learn it, back to front. I also learned it, the vocab on Anki very quickly. And then to take it to the next level, I joined all the Telegram, Discord, and Reddit groups that I could to kind of get a immersion in the language and use it with people who actually speak it every day. And it's been a lot of fun. And the memes are great. How do you write it? Well, there's Sitilen Pona, which is a simple hieroglyphic system. And then there's Sitilen, which we saw here. And I would really, really like it if just one person decided to learn Toki Pona as part of this video. Thank you for listening.
All right, awesome. I think linguist Twitter, the linguist section of Catholic Twitter, will really appreciate that. That was very fascinating.
Oh yeah, sorry. I wanted to say just one more thing about it.
Sure, go ahead.
Obviously, Tolkien translated many prayers into Quenya as part of his quote-unquote secret vice, as he described it. And so I am obviously no Tolkien, and I wasn't even up to the task of learning Quenya, much less creating a language as beautiful as Quenya. But I kind of think that, in our own little way, we can kind of learn a little language and do sort of a little version of what he did. And his prayerfulness and his faith, I think, is a big part of what inspired me to go as hard into this as I did. And I plan to translate more prayers, starting with the ones that he translated, into Quenya in the future. So shout out to Tolkien. Please pray for his canonization.
Awesome. Can we get an Awen in the chat?
Awen, baby.
Yeah.
So Awen means stay or stand or keep. And so in the original translation of the Our Father, Sonia Lang used just Amen. But I was like, well, you already have Awen. And in the Hebrew, it means like, so be it, or like, may it be so, right? And so, I don't know. There's so many like providential coincidences going on here that I,
That's
I'm
very
a
cool.
No graces. Okay, I'll stop talking.
No, you're good. All right, I'm going to take your mic privileges from you.
Yeah, please do.
All right.
That's my ad.
Let's see. Up next is Two Apostles' name. Who is that? Okay, Matt Dunn. All right. Let's get you up in here. Where'd you go? I just saw your name. Well, I can't find it. There you are. Right under my nose. Okay. You should be able to share your screen now.
Good to know I'm here. I was worried.
I was worried that you weren't here for a second.
Exactly. All right, I'm going to share my screen for just a moment here.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Okay, there we go. Share. See a bunch of desktop stuff there, right? Okay,
Yep.
good.
All looks good.
Okay, good. And there we are.
All right.
All right. So first of all, I want to thank Hunter for this great idea, probably the best idea in the history of Catholic Twitter, as well as Nathan for hosting today. And everybody's talks have been awesome. Mine, it's kind of providential that I come up right after somebody talking about John and somebody talking about language, because I'm going to talk about some of the language that John used in writing some parts of his gospel. When I do that as somebody who has an amateur love of John's gospel. I've been reading and studying it for too many years to count now. So that's one reason I chose this topic. Another is that we are now in what I like to call John time, and there's two reasons for that, two ways you can look at that, which with most things having to do with John's gospel is not uncommon. Liturgically, right now is when we've just started to get into John's readings in the gospels on Sunday. And when we do that, we notice that they do skip around the gospel, and that's okay. A couple weeks ago, we read from John chapter 4. Last week was John chapter 9. Emma will be happy to know that tomorrow's readings are John chapter 11, the raising of Lazarus. But so when you skip around, you lose some aspects of what John is trying to point out. But in the context of Sunday readings, that's okay, because it does spare us a bit of a challenge with John, which is another way that you can look at John's concept of time. His chronology is not always identical to the way the synoptic evangelists throw theirs out. I don't have time to go deeply into this, but I'll leave it by saying that I believe John knew his audience was aware of the timeline of Jesus' life, so he didn't feel confined to that linear narrative. This freedom allowed him to use devices that revealed an overall more accurate look at the Logos. One of these devices was, in fact, repetition. If you ask any teacher or parent, they'll tell you it's a very effective teaching tool. And especially if you teach something, repeat it over and over again, and then when they get it, you continue to teach something similarly, but add something else new. And by using that same situations over and over again, sometimes John uses that to hammer home a particular point, and other times he uses that to, once you have it down pat, he'll throw in a twist the next time he does it. I'm going to go over, probably only have time to do 3 examples from the gospel tonight. One that talks about the repetition for the sake of proving a point, and 2 that talk about the recapitulation. But an example of that early hammering things home is water early on in the first 5 chapters of John's gospel. Before I do that, though, I'm going to interrupt myself. John's gospel is very, very symbolic, and sometimes it makes it difficult to understand. One of the keys to understanding symbolism of John, I'll let you in on tonight. Anytime you see the word water in John's gospel, think of baptism. Reread the passage again with baptism in mind. You'll probably gain some insights you didn't have before. In fact, I would say if you forget everything else I say about repetition or recapitulation tonight, and remember that water equals baptism in John's gospel, and you didn't know that already, then my time here will have been worth it. But this is one use of repetition that John has. He spends much of the first 5 chapters talking about, he mentions water a lot, which I assume means he's talking about baptism a lot. We know that we start out in chapter 1, you see John the Baptist at the Jordan. In chapter 2, you got the water becoming wine at Cana. In chapter 3, Nicodemus is told he must be born of water and the Spirit. Chapter 4, we heard from a couple of weeks ago, the Samaritan woman at the well. Chapter 5, you had the man at the pool who was healed after 38 years. So all of these narratives that occur in the first 5 chapters, they not only repeat a theme of water and probably the different aspects of baptism, but also they repeat a theme of repeated questions in which the person continually misunderstands what Jesus is talking about. One of these you may remember from 2 Sundays ago, the Samaritan woman at the well, but the same thing happened. We know that there was some confusion with Nathaniel. We know there was some confusion with the waiters, and Nicodemus saying, how can I be born again, and that kind of a thing. So you have that theme recurring over and over again to the point where by the time it happens all these times, you realize it's a great device that John is using as he's doing this here. And so he basically is going to be using that to hammer home the point, if my theory is correct, about baptism. But another type that is there is what I would call the recapitulation. And in those cases, he will essentially tell the same exact story twice. One of those I'm going to go back to from 2 weeks ago with the Samaritan woman at the well. We all remember that story and the woman saying, Jesus had no bucket, but then she wanted the water so she'd never be thirsty. And the later conversations about his personal life. That was probably something you heard in a homily 2 weeks ago, so I'm not even going to bother talking about that because you know how that went. But lost in the shuffle when this reading is read is what happens next. Most of that story involves just the Jesus and the woman because his disciples had gone to get something to eat. So they come back with food and they tell him to eat. And he says he has food. And they keep asking where his food is. And you realize it's, as with the woman with water, there's the same exact confusion going on. Just like she wanted to know where his water was, they wanted to know where his food was. She didn't know how he could get water without a bucket. They didn't know how he could get food when they were the ones getting food. So it's the same exact conversation. Now Jesus does, as with the woman, he finally explains to them what his food is. His food is to do the will of the Father who sent him. And their food will be to do his will when he sends them. And we know that in 2 chapters, he'll talk about his own flesh as food. But one of the interesting aspects that happens when John tells the same story twice, if you will, is there's almost always some layering going on. And that's the really cool part, is when you see what's going on there. So if my theory holds and the water represents baptism, it would make sense that a Samaritan woman, the outsider, would need that first. Obviously, this is not a perfect comparison because there was no sacramental baptism, and that the apostles didn't even have that. But the concept, because John was aware of the importance of baptism, the concept of giving somebody the water first, and then you get to the next level of initiation, the food that Jesus is going to give us. So it's interesting that they both had the same story, the same almost, who's on first type of misunderstanding, but one was about food and one was about water because of where they were in their journey. I'm going to go back a little bit further into the towards the beginning of the gospel for my next one. It's another case of recapitulation, and that's the call of Nathanael. It's another example of this sort of recapitulation. Nathanael's not one of the more well-known characters in the Bible. He's probably the same apostle known as Bartholomew in the Synoptics. He's only mentioned in John's gospel by the name Nathanael. Of course, we know that Bar was a common beginning of a surname, meant son of, so it's very, very possible that maybe he was Nathanael's son of Ptolemaeus. I don't know, I wasn't there, but we do know that the other Gospels mention Bartholomew, John only mentions Nathanael, and even then is only mentioned twice. When he is mentioned, it's early on in the Gospel when Jesus is calling his first disciples. We know that the first 2 were probably John and Andrew. We know it was Andrew. We assume it was John. And then who were with the Baptist when the Baptist called Jesus the Lamb of God. And so they went and spent time with him and brought in Peter and then Philip, who was so impressed that he told Nathanael that Jesus could be the Messiah. In response to which, Nathanael gave that great vote of confidence in asking, can anything good come from Nazareth? He doesn't buy it. He doesn't think that he can. He's prejudging it based on what he thinks he knows already. So Philip says, well, why don't you come and see? And when they do, first of all, Jesus makes a kind of a smart aleck comment, a pun about Nathanael being willing to speak his mind. That's literally the first thing he says to Nathanael, at which point Nathanael's like, yeah, who are you? You don't even know me. And Jesus points out, oh, yeah, I knew who you were even when you were sitting under the fig tree before Philip got there. Now remember, this sitting under the fig tree was before they met, before Philip even told him about this. There's probably some cool theology we could get into regarding the fig tree, but that's not important now. What blows Nathanael away is that Jesus knew about him and saw him, is the word Jesus uses, before Jesus was even near him to his knowledge. Now, that probably is why Nathanael's response, which may seem a little extreme, he calls him the Son of God and the King of Israel because he saw him under a fig tree, but sometimes that's how encounters with God go, when you realize he was with you all along. So after he says, "You are Son of God and King of Israel," Jesus responds, "You say that because I said I saw you under a fig tree? You'll do greater things like this." And around here is where you may start to see, if you know where I'm going with the recapitulation, you may realize where I'm going with this when you look at the scenario of the apostles being together and they tell Nathanael and he doesn't believe it, and all of a sudden he gets blown away. Well, you realize that it's the same exact story as Thomas after the resurrection. Even compare Jesus' response afterwards. "You believe me because you've seen me," he says to Thomas. It's very, very similar. But as with the comparison of bread and water at the well, we see some layering here as well. Let's look at their responses. Both Nathanael and Thomas make statements that contain two separate sentences about Jesus. All four are true, but there's some layering here. By the time we get to the end of the gospel with Thomas, we're ready for another layer, which is Jesus' divinity. I also find it interesting, by the way, that Thomas is the only apostle who ever called Jesus God, and yet he's the one we always refer to as Doubting Thomas. Kind of sad, actually. There's also some neat symmetry in this. Nathanael begins about 40 verses into the gospel. The Thomas story begins about 40 verses from the end of it. If I had more time, I'd go into talking about how a lot of the recapitulations that John does in this are symmetrically posted like that. If you're a data nerd like me, you'll think of an Excel sheet with embedded formulae. But it's really, really kind of cool if you start to see some of these repetitions and recapitulations that occur, the way he frames them in such a way to make you think about that. And one example of that, right, just to make sure that you're aware of it, the very next narrative after the Thomas story, is when they're in the boat going fishing, and he mentions that there's 7 of them there, but only names 5 of them, and Nathanael's one of the 5. He was also one of the 5 first that were called back in chapter 1, and also this is the only other time he's mentioned. So perhaps John is just trying to remind us that, hey, see what I'm doing here is we're layering things because it's important. I probably, like I said, I could go on for hours talking about this stuff, but I do want to be respectful to the rest of the speakers tonight, and I just want to thank you guys again. If any of you would like to reach out to me with questions or hop on Twitter, my handle there is 2 Apostles' Name.
All right, thank you, Matt. That was awesome. More Gospel of John stuff. Always good. I'm always blown away by what a good writer he was when I look into that stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Up next, I think AJ is next. So let me see here. Is he in the chat? Yes. Is that Josh? Let me find you in my list. There you are. Okay. Make co-host. Okay. Josh, you should be able to share your screen, and we should be able to hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, cool.
Yep. Take it away.
So due to very low bandwidth, I cannot use my camera or anything. So today you get the podcast version of my talk.
Awesome.
All right. So first off, shout out to Hunter for having this super great idea. Also, thank you to Nathan for moderating, and thank you to everyone listening. For those of you who don't know me, I am at Arion Jessamine on Twitter, also known as AJ. And for the past couple of years, I've been studying philosophy at Franciscan University of Steubenville. At Franciscan, I joined what we call a household, which is kind of like a religious order, but without the vows, obviously. We take a pledge to live according to a certain rule or way of life. The household I joined is called the Brotherhood of St. Francis, or BSF for short. So today I will be discussing how BSF lives out, and by extension how you can too, our devotion to Franciscan spirituality through our 5 charisms of poverty, humility, charity, chivalry, and joy. First off, you can't follow St. Francis's example without also following Lady Poverty. Now, of course, being a college student, I can't just sell all of my stuff, and most of you are probably not in a position to do that either. If your vocation is marriage, for example, you have to provide for your family, so you can't live the radical poverty that St. Francis did. However, you can still have a poverty attitude and apply it to your life. So BSF's mindset towards stuff is twofold. Does this item correspond to your vocation or current state of life? And does the item cause you to give praise to God? So for example, say I wanted to buy myself a new video game or something. I would ask myself, does the video game correspond to my vocation or state in life? My state in life is currently student, and I know the video game probably won't help me study. In fact, it may hinder it. Now, it's possible that it will help me de-stress after a long day, and in that way help me to live the life that I should be living, and also cause me to give praise to God. But maybe I know that since it is a single player game, it will likely cause me to isolate myself from others and maybe distract me from my duties. So in this way, I would discern that this game would not be a good purchase, and maybe I could find a different game that I could play like with my household brothers, thereby promoting brotherhood, which gives praise to God. You can apply these 2 questions to anything that you already have or anything you want to buy. Does this correspond to my vocation? And does it cause me to give praise to God? Using this method, we in BSF aspire to live a simple life. Secondly, our charism of humility. I am always blown away by how humble a man St. Francis was. One of my favorite stories of St. Francis tells of him meeting a leper. Even though the sight of the leper was disgusting to him, St. Francis unhesitantly embraced him. Then, when St. Francis mounted his horse to leave, he turned to wave farewell to the leper. But though the plain lay open on all sides, he could no longer see the leper anywhere. Who are the lepers in our own lives? How often do we look down on others for their political beliefs or spiritual convictions, or maybe even just because they look a little bit different from us? St. Francis named his order the Friars Minor as a constant reminder that we are called to be less than everyone else. We're called to humble ourselves just as Jesus did. Pride is the root of all sin, and humility, vice versa, is the root of all virtue. A practice I really like to grow in humility that I learned from my household is that of not bringing up oneself in conversation. So if someone asks you about yourself, you can answer, but you aren't the one bringing yourself up. This is really good because it forces us to put others first and take the focus off of ourselves. We never realize how much we talk and think about ourselves until we purposefully try not to. So for example, I might be at the cafeteria eating breakfast with someone and I want to make conversation. First thing that comes to my mind is that I didn't sleep well that night. But I can't bring myself up in conversation, so instead I'm forced to think of the other person. I should ask, how did they sleep? Now we see the focus on others instead of on ourselves. Taking the focus off of ourselves brings us to the next charism, which is charity. Charity speaks pretty well for itself, but in a special way, St. Francis always emphasized in a particular way charity towards the poor, just like Jesus did. Now, my household BSF will do things like canned food drives and serving at a soup kitchen, but even if you can't do a big project, there's always little things you can do. Maybe you can give a gift card to a beggar, maybe you can donate some of your old clothes to St. Vincent de Paul or another thrift store, Maybe you can even just smile at the elderly lady you pass after every Mass. Living in service of others is not just for the rich or those with a lot of time on their hands. We are all called to live that way. Next is chivalry. Now, if you know anything about St. Francis's early years, you know that he was a knight. You also know that he sucked at being a knight, but the chivalry and courtesy that he gained by his upbringing stuck with him all his life. While chivalry obviously applies to how a man acts towards a woman, we also give a special courtesy to priests who are Christ's representatives on earth. St. Francis always showed the utmost respect to priests and once said, quote, "If I met an angel of light and a drunken priest walking down the road, I would first kiss the priest's hands and then greet the angel," unquote. I sincerely hope that now that Masses have been canceled all over America, we may finally realize how important priests are and how dependent we are on them. These are incredible men. Are they perfect? Of course not. No one is. But they are still the only apostolic authority given by Christ to both forgive sins and celebrate the Mass, and we really need that. They deserve our respect. So that's poverty, humility, charity, chivalry, and lastly, my favorite charism of the Brotherhood of St. Francis, that is joy. Once when St. Francis was walking with one of his friars, Brother Leo, he said to him, "Brother Leo, when we come to St. Mary of the Angels, soaked by the rain and frozen by the cold, all soiled with mud and suffering from hunger, and we ring at the gate and the porter comes and says angrily, 'Who are you?' And we say, 'We are two of your brothers.' And he contradicts us and says, 'You are not telling the truth. You are two rascals who deceive people and steal from the poor. Go away.' If we endure all his insults and injuries with patience, oh, Brother Leo, that is perfect joy." Nothing is more incredible to me than this, to rejoice in suffering. And friends, we are suffering now. The whole world, in fact, is suffering. But Jesus understands suffering better than anyone. St. Teresa of Calcutta said, quote, "Suffering is a sign that you have come so close to Jesus that he can kiss you," unquote. We all want happiness. We were literally made for it. If you ever wondered how to best achieve it, just remember, if we endure all these things with patience, that is perfect joy. Patient acceptance of the Father's will. I am going to leave you with St. Francis's commissioning. He said, "Go, proclaim to all men, preach penance for the remission of sins. Be patient in tribulation, watchful in prayer, strong in labor, moderate in speech, grave in conversation, thankful for benefits. For if you shall observe all these things, an eternal kingdom is prepared for you. Cast thy care upon the Lord, and he will nourish thee." Thank you all for listening. If anyone wants to learn more about Franciscan spirituality, specifically how the Brotherhood of St. Francis does it at Franciscan University, let me know. You can find me on Twitter. My handle is @ArionJessamine. I'll put it in the chat because, yeah. Pax et bonum. Back to you.
All right, thank you, Josh. Thank you for sharing your witness with Franciscan spirituality. We've got one more for the night, for this afternoon session, from Jape Sentner. I think that's right. Let's see if you are here somewhere. I will find you. JP. There you are. Okay. You're now a co-host.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep. Hear you loud and clear.
Awesome. And can we see my screen?
Hit share screen.
Wait. Now?
Not yet.
Where are you? I have no idea what just happened.
Do you have share screen at the bottom of your window?
I thought I pressed it.
Maybe you have to pick a window or give it permission. Oh, there you go.
Okay, perfect.
All right, all yours.
There we go. All right, and hi, my name's JP. We're going to talk about baseball, specifically why the save is the worst stat in baseball. So first off, the save. This is directly screenshotted from MLB.com. It's awarded to a relief pitcher who finishes the game for a winning team under the following circumstances. Normally, it's when the relief pitcher enters the game with no more than 3 runs and pitches at least 1 inning, or enters the game with a tying run in the on-deck circle. There's also the pitch at least 3 innings, but you very rarely see 3-inning saves outside of the postseason. So what do I mean by the worst stat? I'm not really talking about player evaluation here, because if you look at any hitting stat, they all evaluate the player in a correct way, although some better evaluate more than others. And I think you can say that, okay, most counting stats aren't great stats, where you can tell more by a player by their batting average than the amount of hits they have, or something like that. But a lot of times when people ask what the worst stat in baseball is, a lot of people will think of wins and losses for a pitcher, because overall those really aren't great stats for evaluating a player. A lot of times in history they've been overrated. For example, Jacob deGrom back in 2018, he had a 10-9 win-loss record, which really isn't that great, but still had a 170 earned run average, which is the best in the league, and he was the Cy Young Award winner that year. But then also there's the hold, which is just a crappy stat people use for relief pitchers that nobody really cares about. Then there's the save percentage, which, like I said, percentages are better than just accounting stats. But overall, saves, well, they're not like a bad way to evaluate a pitcher. They're not the best way, but they're also the most used way when we come to relief pitchers. So because of that, the save changes the way the game is managed in a negative manner. What do I mean like that? So the save that usually is attributed to the closer. The closer is pretty much always the best pitcher in the bullpen. They're the one who goes out to get the save opportunity. So usually they're being marched out of the bullpen in the 9th inning when their team has a small lead, and they just close out the game, thus the name the closer. Here we see a picture of Mariano Rivera, the Sandman himself, who is probably the greatest closer of all time. He's really cemented the role for how we see it in modern bullpens. So now I'm going to quote a book, The Only Rules It Has to Work by Ben Lindbergh and Sam Miller, which is, I finished this book a few weeks ago, and never more have I read a book and wanted to see it become a movie. One of my favorite books, but the story in this book is how 2 stat nerds got to help basically run a not a minor league team, but an unaffiliated minor league team. So the manager, who was more traditional old school type, his thought was the closer is because he's the closer. That's just how it goes. The closer goes in when there's in the 9th inning when they've got a lead. No other time the closer goes in to get the save, period. That's how it works. But this view can be problematic and in many ways can cost you a game. So looking at probably 2 best examples of the closer. Again, we've got Mariano Rivera on the left and then Aroldis Chapman on the right. I'd say, obviously, like I said, Rivera's the greatest closer of all time, but I'd argue that Chapman's had the best career of any closer currently in baseball. I know some people might say, well, he really hasn't performed that well in the postseason. For that, I'd say in 2016 when he was with the Cubs and gave up that home run to Rajai Davis in Game 7 of the World Series. He was clearly fatigued, and Joe Maddon should have taken him out. And then this past ALCS with the Yankees against the Astros on Jose Altuve's walk-off home run, buzz, that wasn't Chapman's fault. But I want to use one specific closer as an example. I want to do a modern example, but I'm not going to use Chapman mostly just because he the Yankees bullpen has 3 closer caliber pitchers, so not really as appropriate for this viewpoint. But also, I wanted to pick a closer who's a decent human being, and some of you may know he was suspended a few years ago for domestic violence. So going through some other closers, Josh Hader had some racist tweets. Roberto Ozuna was also had domestic violence. Felipe Vasquez had a relationship with a 13-year-old. Jason Grilli, in his autobiography, literally compared himself to Jesus in a very odd manner. But Kirby Yates seems like a decent human being. That's all we have from his personal life page section of his Wikipedia page. So let's go with him. So here's his the top of his baseball reference page. We can see last year he had a fantastic season, 1.19 ERA. For those of you who don't know, ERA, that's earned run to average. So that's earned runs per 9 innings, 41 saves, and then 101 strikeouts, and a whip of 0.890. Whip is walks and hits per innings pitched. Normally, realistically, if you have below 1 of a whip, it's very, very good. So let's compare him to the rest of the Padres bullpen, the rest of their relief pitchers. So obviously there's some things that stand out here. First, ERA, where you see he's got a fantastic 1.19, but everybody else 4.71, 3.29, 4, 5.65. That's not that great. There's a very clear difference between Yates and the rest of the bullpen. And then going off, the other 3 stats I want to talk about are FIP, WHIP, and ERA+. So FIP, that is fielding independent pitching. So what that does, it's like ERA, where it's a similar earned run number, but you're focusing only on the 3 true outcomes. So that's strikeouts, walks, and home runs. So basically, we're not leaving anything up to the chance of the fielders. What does the pitcher themselves deal? So he has a 130 FIP, while everybody else has a FIP of above 3. And again, WHIP, which I already talked about, everyone else is a good chunk above 1. Then ERA+, this is a stat that's come, a lot of people have been talking about recently. So it's a comparative stat where it just brings everybody to 1 average. So 100 is the MLB average, and you want the higher the better. So obviously 358 of an ERA+, that's fantastic. Well, everybody else is right above, right below average. So by far, Kirby Yates is the best pitcher in the Padres bullpen. So let's go to a hypothetical situation. It's just some random game from last season. We've got the Rockies against the Padres. And I don't care whether it's home or away, who's home or is away, but also there might be some people saying where Petco Park is the most pitcher-friendly ballpark and Coors Field is the most hitter-friendly ballpark, so that depends on the situation. No, doesn't at all for the scenario. So the Padres are leading 3-1 in the 8th inning, and the Rockies 2, 3, and 4 batters are due up. So the 2, 3, and 4 batters are Trevor Story, David Dahl, and Nolan Arenado. And Arenado is arguably the best third baseman in the National League. So if we look at some of their stats, Story, I'm going to focus mainly on OPS plus because very similar to ERA plus, that's in better comparative stats where you're able to use it compared against all ballparks across all time periods, where again 100 is average and the higher the better. So again, we see that Story has a 118 OPS plus, Arenado with a 129 OPS plus, and then David Dahl with a 109 OPS plus. Those are all very good. All 3 of them were all-stars last season. But if we look at the remainder of the Rockies lineup, they're all significantly below average. So we've got the Padres have a 3-1 lead. Story, Dahl, and Arenado are due up. What happens? So most likely, Mott Strom, who was considered the Padres' 8th inning guy, would go in for the Padres. We looked at some of his stats earlier. He had a 4.71 ERA, 90 ERA plus, 4.41 FIP, and a 1.247 WHIP. That's not that great. So we really have 2 scenarios here. Scenario A is the Rockies All-Stars hit Strom well. The Padres end up losing the lead. So if the Rockies end up taking the lead, it's a 4-3 lead going into either the bottom of the 8th or the top of the 9th. Then Kirby Yates isn't coming in to pitch the ninth inning, because you don't put your closer out there when you're losing the game. Scenario B is Strom gets out there with a clean inning and the Padres are still winning, but Kirby Yates in to face the bottom of the Rockies lineup. And realistically, having a guy who's arguably the best relief pitcher in baseball come in to face 3 below average guys, it almost seems like you're wasting using your best pitcher. Well, it's realistically what it is. We're having this is just one example, one scenario that happens. We see stuff like this happen all the time in baseball, where you have the closer come in to face just the bottom of the lineup and just mow them down, while you might have the best hitters on a team just absolutely destroy some random middle reliever. So of course, there's other situations that we could talk about, whether the game is tied in the 9th or extra innings. And since I only have 10 minutes, I don't really want to get into those, just simply because there's a lot of debates on how you use your closer in extra innings. But then also there's the playoffs, and all around how managers use their bullpen in playoffs is much, much different than it is in the regular season. But one thing I will say on managing your bullpen in the playoffs: if it's Game 7 of the World Series, you're holding on to a slim lead, and you have the best pitcher in baseball sitting in the bullpen, not coming in, you deserve to lose that game. Also, the Astros deserve to lose because bang, bang, buzz, buzz. But still, that was very, very, very poor bullpen usage from the Astros. And good for the Nationals for taking down the new most hated team in baseball. So what are the solutions that we have to better use the bullpen and have the best relievers actually go up against the best hitters? So the first one that a lot of people will bring up that's come to fame recently is the idea of the opener. So the opener is a closer caliber pitcher who will open the game. So here I've got a picture of Sergio Romo pitching for the Rays, who was really the first opener that we saw in Major League Baseball, and helped kickstart this idea around, mostly just because the first inning, you're guaranteed to face the top of the other team's lineup. You're going to face their best hitters. So why not have in your best closer, your best pitcher, who will be able to go in there and just be able to take care of business for 1 to 2 innings. So that way you can have your normal starter come in normally with a clean 2nd or 3rd inning, and then just have them go much longer, usually into the 7th, 8th, or maybe even the 9th inning, so that you don't even have to worry about bullpen later. This way, you're guaranteed to get the best reliever in against the best hitters, and this way the normal starter will be able to start the game against the bottom of the lineup, so that he'll be able to get into the hang of things. And then by the time he's facing the top of the lineup, he's already in the group, and he'll be able to move on through his next 6-7 innings. The second, in the more prominent idea, since we're talking about mostly relievers, is the idea of the firearm reliever. This is something that was used in the book that I mentioned earlier. There are only rules it has to work, and they use near the end of their season, they used what was originally their closer as this firearm guy. So it's the team's top reliever who goes in when he's needed and stays in as long as he can. So this way, you not only have your reliever pitching against the best guys, but also he's getting innings. He's clearly able to work well. So if we go back to the Padres bullpen stats, we see here that Kirby Yates, he pitched in 60 games, but only 60 and 2 innings, 60 and 2/3 innings. That's not a lot, especially when you look at Matt Strom, their 8th inning guy, who had 114 innings. And then the other 3 guys, 82, 72, 51 innings. Your best pitcher was pitching second to the last in innings throughout the bullpen. Why don't you want your best pitcher pitching as much as he can? This is clearly just poor bullpen usage, because the best way for you to win a baseball game is for you to have your best pitchers out there. So yes, will Kirby Yates be getting more innings, but he's also going to be getting more rest days, because odds are they're not going to need him as often, instead of just bringing him in the 9th inning every other night. And like I said, using your top reliever, it's something that managers should want to do. There's just watching your team lose the game because you have your middle relievers in. That's frustrating. You want to see your best reliever out there just mowing down the best hitters on a team. And then a lot of people will say, well, we only use the save, so why not figure out another way to keep track of some sort of stats, keep track of these for relievers. And then Jason Stark, an ESPN baseball writer, came up with this idea back in 2016. Really fascinating article called "Why Baseball Should Replace the Save Statistic." And this article actually got me into hating the save a few years ago. So his idea was give certain amount of points based upon the game scenario. Certain amount of points if it's a 1-run lead versus a 2-run lead versus a 3-run lead. If they go in more than just 1 inning, give them extra points. I don't know if it says it here, but he also mentioned, I think he mentioned the article I just came up my own, get extra points for based on where they are in the lineup, so that you're not getting the same amount of points for mowing down the 7th, 8th, and 9th hitter versus battling the 2, 3, and 4 hitter. So this way it's a new stat, so we can actually bring in these challenges and use the bullpen most efficiently. So in conclusion, this problem has been relevant for a while. Like I said, that ESPN article was written back in 2016. That the minor league team that I was talking about from the book, that they were managing that team back in 2015. But realistically, we haven't seen these changes in the bullpen in a consistent way at the MLB. And something realistically, I think it's going to be the next quote unquote Moneyball move that we see. And realistically, bullpens should be used to secure wins, not stats. It's the type of thing where, let's just say it's a football game. One of your wide receivers has a 10-game streak of getting 50 yards, and he doesn't have 50 yards yet this game, but you're down by 4 with a minute left. But that receiver, he's been double teamed all game. Who are you going to go to? Towards the receiver to make sure he can get those 50 yards, or it's one of your open guys so that you can actually score the touchdown, win the game. It's the same idea here. You want to be able to care more about winning than just getting the stat so that they might be able to make the All-Star game because for whatever reason, that's the only stat that many managers and fans look at. And overall, managing bullpen is very, very difficult because you've got the whole extra innings thing. You've got lefty-righty matchups, all this incredible variables. But it's not difficult to not be dumb. You want your best reliever in there at all time, as much as possible. And that's pretty much all I've got. So thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks to Hunter and Nathan for organizing all this. And stay healthy, everybody.
All right, thank you, JP. That concludes our afternoon session. We'll open back up. Actually, if you stay on the call, we're going to leave the room open. We're going to leave the Zoom call open for the evening session tonight, which starts at 7. But everyone's going to be muted until about 6:30, 6:45. So hopefully we'll see you tonight. In the meantime, I don't know, go eat dinner or something. And
Yeah, go take a break.
that's it.